Montana Territory. October 1881. The town's most respected builder stood at the edge of the property, arms crossed, shaking his head. "Madam," he said loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "this will become your tomb." But Sarah Oland kept digging. What he called dangerous, what the neighbors called foolish, what the town council called an eyesore, will become the reason 23 families survived the winter of 1882. Today, you'll understand why the worst idea became the most copied design in 3 counties. Before we begin, if you want to learn one proven frontier technique every week, methods that worked when survival actually depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to Medicine Creek Valley, because what happened there changed everything. Sarah Oland was 32 years old when she became a widow. Swedish immigrant. 2 children. A land claim that sat on the eastern bench of Medicine Creek Valley, where the wind cut across the prairie like a blade. Her husband, Johan, had died that spring, kicked by a horse while breaking sod. Left her with 80 acres, a half-built log frame, and a stack of debt to the sawmill. By the settlement standards, she had 3 choices: remarry quickly, sell the claim, or fail before winter. She chose none of them. Medicine Creek Valley had a problem that nobody wanted to admit. The standard log cabins, 12 by 16 feet, chinked with clay and moss, single stone hearth on the gable end, consumed ungodly amounts of firewood. 3 to 4 cords per winter per family. And even then, you woke up to frost on the inside of the walls. The valley sat in a geographic trap, open to the northwest, where the worst winds came from. Sparse timber, mostly cottonwood and willow along the creek, a few scrubby pines on the ridges. Firewood was labor. Firewood was money. Firewood was the difference between making it and not. Every family dealt with the same physics. Wind pressure against the walls, cold rising through the floorboards, heat vanishing up the chimney faster than you could feed the fire. Draft gaps, thin walls, exposed roof. The standard cabin was a wooden box fighting a losing war against the cold. Sarah looked at her half-built frame and made a decision that would make her target. She was going to build into the hillside. Not beside it, not against it, into it. A half-dugout design. The south-facing slope behind her claim rose about 15 feet. Gentle grade, stable soil, good drainage. She'd excavate 6 feet back into that hill. 3 walls would be earth-backed. North, east, west. The south wall would be stone and timber with small windows to catch winter sun. The roof would be sod, thick sod, maybe 18 inches of earth cover. And the hearth? Stone, massive, set against the north wall, where the earth itself would become a heat battery. When word got around, people stopped by just to stare. You're building a root cellar to live in? You'll drown in there when the snow melts. Dirt walls, Sarah? Really? She didn't argue. She just kept digging. Let me show you exactly what she was building, because the details matter. Sarah hired 2 men from the Swedish community, Anders Blom and his son Eric, to help with the excavation. They carved 6 feet horizontally into the hillside, creating a rectangular cavity roughly 14 feet wide and 18 feet deep. The back wall and side walls were pure earth, cut clean and vertical, packed hard by centuries of root systems and clay. She reinforced those walls with vertical posts sunk into the ground and horizontal planks to prevent cave-ins. But the earth itself would do most of the work. Insulation, thermal mass, wind barrier, all in one. The south-facing wall was where the skill came in. She used sandstone, pulled from a collapsed foundation 2 miles up the valley, and laid a wall 3 feet high with a batter angled slightly inward for stability. Above that, timber framing with 2 small windows, each about 18 inches square. Not for light, for solar gain. The roof was the bold part. She didn't just lay sod over a few poles. She built a proper timber frame, cottonwood logs, 8 inches thick, spaced 16 inches apart, running front to back. Over that, a layer of willow branches woven tight. Then burlap sacks, then sod, laid in overlapping rows like shingles, grass side up, 18 inches deep when finished. Maybe 2,000 pounds of earth overhead. And the hearth. She placed it against the north wall, the wall that was pure earth-backed, built it from the same sandstone as the south wall. 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, with a firebox designed narrow and tall to maximize draft and radiant heat. The chimney ran up through the roof, but the key was the mass. That hearth weighed close to 4,000 pounds. It would absorb heat all day and radiate it back all night. When people asked why she was doing this, she'd point to the old trapper, a man named Caleb Moss who'd lived with the Mandan people up north. He told her about earth lodges, structures that stayed cool in summer, warm in winter, lasted decades. She'd listened. She'd adapted. But the experts hated it. Gustav Reinhardt, the valley's master builder, a German immigrant who'd put up 30-plus cabins in 6 years, showed up one afternoon with a frown that could crack stone. "Madame Oland," he said, voice loud enough for the crew to hear, "I must speak plainly. This structure violates every principle of sound construction." Sarah looked up from where she was mixing clay mortar. "Which principle?" "Her Reinhardt." "Moisture," he said. "Earth walls will wick water into your timbers. Your roof posts will rot within a year. The whole thing will collapse, or worse, mold will kill your children before the cold does." "The earth is dry," Sarah said. "I chose this slope for drainage. Dry now. Wait until spring melt. Wait until a heavy rain. You're building a cistern, not a cabin." He walked the perimeter, shaking his head. "And this roof, 2,000 pounds of wet sod directly over your heads? That's a death trap. One timber fails, the whole thing comes down." Sarah didn't flinch. "The Mandan build heavier. The Mandan," Reinhardt said slowly, "are not subject to the laws of property and liability that govern this settlement. You are." Then came a town council. Henry Ashford, who ran the land office, rode out with 2 other men. They stood at a distance, didn't even dismount. "Mrs. Oland," Ashford called, "we're concerned about property values. If you're building, whatever this is, it affects the whole settlement. People want to know their neighbors are maintaining standards." Standards. That word hung in the air like smoke. But the cruelest judgment came from the women. A proper widow would build a proper house. She's teaching her children to live like prairie dogs. No decent man will homestead next to a dirt mound. One woman, Margaret Carver, a minister's wife, said it to Sarah's face at the Sunday service. "You're making us all look uncivilized." Sarah had one defender. Caleb Moss, the old trapper. He showed up one morning, chewed tobacco, watched her work. "Mandan lodges I seen," he said, "some of them 50 years old. Still standing. Still warm. Earth don't burn. Earth don't blow away. Earth's the best insulation God ever made." But when Caleb spoke, people smiled and nodded and ignored him. He was a relic, a man who'd gone native. What did he know about proper Christian homesteading? Sarah kept building. By late November, the cabin was finished. Roof sealed, hearth cured, door hung, a thick plank door with a leather hinge, set deep into the stone entryway. Inside, it was dark, cool, and utterly silent. The earth swallowed sound. No wind, no creak of timbers, just stillness. Sarah moved in with her 2 children, Ingrid, age 9, and Carl, age 6. She stacked firewood in the corner, hung her pots, set up sleeping pallets along the west wall where the earth radiated a constant, gentle coolness. The neighbors watched, some with pity, some with contempt, none with envy. Gustav Reinhardt made one final visit. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 other builders, men who'd worked with him on cabins across the valley. They walked the property like inspectors, tapping posts, checking joints, peering at the sod roof. Finally, Reinhardt turned to Sarah. "Madam," he said, and his tone had shifted. No longer loud, almost gentle. "I've built in cold country for 15 years. Bavaria, Dakota. Here, I know what works and what doesn't. This," he gestured at the Hillside cabin. "This is dangerous." "Why?" Sarah asked. "Ventilation," he said. "You have 2 small windows and a chimney. If that fire burns low, if the draft reverses, carbon smoke will settle. It's heavier than air, and in an enclosed earth structure, it has nowhere to go. You'll suffocate in your sleep." One of the other builders nodded. "And if the roof settles just an inch or 2 from soil compression, Your door frame will bind. You'll be trapped. Reinhardt softened his voice further. I don't say this to humiliate you. I say it because I've seen good people die from bad construction. Please, reconsider. We'll help you build a proper cabin. Standard frame. You can sell this structure for storage. Sarah met his eyes. I appreciate your concern, Herr Reinhardt, but I'm staying. He sighed, tipped his hat. Then God be with you. As he rode off, one of the men muttered loud enough for Sarah to hear, "Stubborn woman. She'll learn the hard way." The social judgment was worse. At the settlement's Thanksgiving gathering, held in the church, a drafty log building with gaps you could see daylight through, Sarah sat in the back with her children. Women whispered, not even quietly, "She's living in a hole. I heard she doesn't even have real windows. What kind of mother raises children underground?" Margaret Carver approached her after the meal, smiled, spoke softly. "Sarah, dear, we worry about you. A woman alone needs community. But how can we welcome you when you've chosen to live like something less than civilized?" Sarah stood, took her children's hands, and left. On the walk home, Ingrid asked, "Mama, why do they say mean things?" Sarah stopped, crouched down. "Because they're afraid." "Of what?" "Of being wrong." Carl tugged her sleeve. "Are we safe, Mama?" She looked at the hillside ahead, their home, half buried in the earth, smoke rising steady from the chimney. Safer than they know. January 1882. It started with the wind. Not the usual prairie wind, the kind that rattled shutters and made you pull your coat tight. This was different. A low, constant roar that came out of the northwest and didn't stop. It drove the temperature down and kept it there. January 9th, minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. January 11th, minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. January 14th, minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. And then it got worse. January 17th, the thermometer outside the land office hit minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. 40 below once you factored in the wind. Cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. Cold that cracked green timber. Cold that killed livestock in their stalls. Medicine Creek Valley had seen bad winters before, but nothing like this. The settlement ran on a rhythm. Families cut firewood in fall, stacked it, rationed it through winter. A standard cabin needed about 3 to 4 cords to make it from November to March. Most families had cut 5 just to be safe. But 3 weeks of deep cold changes the math. Fires that normally burn 4 to 5 hours between feedings now needed constant attention. Every 2 hours, someone had to get up, go outside into that killing wind, bring in more wood, feed the stove. The wood burned faster because the cold was relentless, sucking heat through every wall, every gap, every nail hole. And then the supply line broke. A snowstorm hit on January 20th. Not heavy snow, but wind-driven, the kind that filled every trail, every road, every gap between the trees. The logging camp up the valley, where families bought extra cords when they ran short, became unreachable. No wagons, no sleds, no resupply. People started rationing. The Hendersons, a family of 6 in a standard cabin a half-mile from Sarah's claim, began burning furniture. First the spare chair, then the table legs, then pieces of the bed frame, anything that wasn't load-bearing. The Kowalskis, who lived closest to town, moved their 3 children into one bed and piled every quilt, coat, and spare cloth on top. The parents slept in shifts, one of them awake to keep the fire alive. Inside those cabins, frost formed on the interior walls. Not condensation. Frost. Ice crystals growing on the inside of your home. Children cried from the cold. Hands too numb to hold a spoon. Feet that ached even wrapped in wool. And every morning, the temperature dropped further. January 24th, minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. January 26th, minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit again. January 28th, still minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. People stopped visiting each other, stopped going to town unless absolutely necessary. The settlement became a scatter of smoking chimneys and silent desperation. Gustav Reinhardt's own cabin, well-built, double-chinked, with a stone hearth he designed himself, was suffering. He'd burned through 2 cords already. His wife had taken to heating stones in the fire, and wrapping them in cloth to place in the children's beds. It helped for an hour, maybe two. He thought about Sarah Oland, wondered if she was still alive. On January 30th, a neighbor, Marcus Fletcher, who lived a quarter-mile from Sarah's Hillside cabin, ran out of firewood. Completely out. He burned everything, his spare lumber, his tool handles, the outhouse bench. He wrapped his family in every blanket they owned and made the decision to walk to Sarah's place. Not for help, for witness. If she'd frozen, he'd at least know to avoid her mistake. If she'd survived, maybe she had a trick he could borrow. He trudged through the snow, wind cutting at his face, and stopped at the base of the hillside. Smoke rose from her chimney. Thin, steady. He walked closer. No sound of frantic wood chopping. No panic. Just quiet. He knocked. Sarah opened the door. She was wearing a single wool sweater. Not even a coat. Behind her, Marcus could see into the cabin. The children were sitting near the hearth, playing with carved wooden animals. No blankets piled on them. No shivering. The air inside wasn't just warm. It was comfortable. Mrs. Oland, Marcus said, breath fogging in the cold. Are you all right? Sarah nodded. We're fine. Do you need something? Marcus blinked. How much firewood have you burned? She glanced back at her woodpile. Maybe a third of a cord since this cold started. A third. His voice was flat, disbelieving. The hearth holds heat, Sarah said. I feed it once in the evening, once before bed. Sometimes once in the middle of the night if it's very cold. But the earth keeps us warm. Marcus stood there, freezing, staring at a woman who looked like she'd just come from a mild autumn day. I don't. He shook his head. We're burning everything. How are you not frozen? Sarah stepped aside. Come in. Warm yourself. He did. The moment he crossed the threshold, he felt it. Not just warmth, stability. The air inside was still. No drafts. No cold spots. The stone hearth radiated heat like a sleeping giant. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling felt neutral. Not cold. Not even cool. Just there. He stood by the hearth and felt the cold drain out of his bones. How long can you keep this up? He asked. All winter, Sarah said. I have 2 cords left. I'll use maybe 1. Marcus looked at her, looked at the children, healthy and calm. Looked at the thick stone hearth, the earth-backed walls, the low ceiling that trapped every degree of heat. They said you were crazy. Sarah smiled. Sad. Knowing. I know. They were wrong. She handed him a small bundle of kindling and a split log. Take this. Get your fire going again. And tomorrow, if the cold breaks, come back. I'll show you how it works. Marcus left, walked back through the wind with that small bundle of wood clutched to his chest like a treasure. And when he got home and told his wife what he'd seen, she didn't believe him. Not yet, but she would. Stay with me. Because what happens next changed frontier building forever. If this story is worth your time, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you haven't already. And drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you've ever experienced was. I want to hear your stories. Now, let's see what happened when the numbers came out. Sarah Oland kept a journal. Not a diary, a log. Temperatures. Firewood consumption. Hours between feedings. She'd learned it from her father back in Sweden, a man who believed that if you couldn't measure something, you couldn't improve it. Every morning at dawn, she'd check the thermometer hanging just inside her door. Every evening before bed, she'd note how much wood she'd used. Simple records. Careful records. When the cold finally broke in early February, those records became evidence. February 3rd, the temperature climbed back to a merciful 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind died. The settlement exhaled. People emerged from their cabins, haggard, exhausted, their wood piles devastated. Gustav Reinhardt had burned through 4 cords in those 3 weeks. 4 cords. His hands were raw from splitting. His back ached from hauling. His children had spent 17 nights sleeping in the same bed, packed together like cordwood, while he and his wife took shifts keeping the fire alive. The Kowalskis had burned furniture, fence posts, and part of their wagon bed. They'd survived, but barely. The Hendersons had run out of wood entirely on January 29th and spent 2 nights at a neighbor's cabin. All 9 people crammed into a space built for 5. Across the settlement, the toll was the same: depleted wood exhausted families, and a creeping fear that if the cold had lasted one more week, people would have started dying. Then Marcus Fletcher started talking. He told his wife first, then his neighbor, then anyone who'd listen. She wasn't even wearing a coat. The children were playing, like it was autumn. How much did she burn? A third of a cord, maybe less. People didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. It violated everything they knew about surviving winter in Medicine Creek Valley. So they went to see for themselves. February 5th, a small group rode out to Sarah's Hillside cabin. Gustav Reinhardt was among them. So was Henry Ashford from the town council. So was Margaret Carver, the minister's wife who'd called Sarah uncivilized. Sarah met them at the door. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Carver." She nodded. "Come to check if I'm still alive." Reinhardt had the decency to look embarrassed. "Mrs. Oland, we've heard reports about your winter. We'd like to understand what happened here." "What happened," Sarah said, "is that I stayed warm." She invited them inside. The moment they entered, they felt it. The same thing Marcus had felt. Stable warmth. Not the blast of heat you get standing next to a roaring fire. Not the cold shock of a cabin where the fires died down. Just equilibrium. The hearth still radiated heat, even though the fire had burned down to coals hours ago. Reinhardt walked to the north wall, the earth-backed wall where the hearth sat. He placed his palm against the stone. Warm. Not hot. Warm. Like touching sun-heated rock in the evening. "The mass," he murmured. "It's still releasing." "All night," Sarah said. "I build the fire up in the evening. By the time we go to bed, the stones have absorbed heat. They give back slowly. 6 hours. 8 hours. Sometimes 10. Ashford was examining the walls. No frost. No condensation. "How?" "The earth insulates," Sarah explained. "It doesn't conduct heat like wood does. The cold can't pull warmth through 3 feet of soil the way it pulls through 6 inches of pine. And the sod roof, all that mass overhead, it holds temperature steady. Doesn't heat up fast, doesn't cool down fast." Margaret Carver was looking at the children. Healthy, rosy-cheeked, playing quietly with their wooden toys. "How much firewood did you use?" she asked. Her voice was different now. Smaller. Sarah walked to her journal, opened it, ran her finger down the columns. From January 9th, when the cold started, through February 2nd, when it broke, I burned approximately 1/3 of a cord. Maybe 40 cubic feet of split wood. Reinhardt's head snapped up. 40 cubic feet? Yes. I burned over 200. Silence. Sarah continued, reading from her log. Internal temperature during the worst days, January 24th through January 30th, stayed between 58 and 62 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 14 to 17 degrees Celsius. I fed the fire once in early evening, once before bed, and occasionally once in the middle of the night if the outside temperature dropped below -30. She looked up. On the coldest morning, January 26th, when it hit -38 outside, the cabin was still 60 degrees inside. I woke up warm. Marcus Fletcher, who'd come along with the group, spoke up. I was burning wood every 2 hours. Every 2 hours, or the cabin would drop to near freezing. "I know," Sarah said quietly. "That's convective loss. Your heat rises, escapes through the roof, gets replaced by cold air pulled in through the floor. It's a cycle. My design breaks that cycle." Reinhardt was doing math in his head. 60 degrees inside, -38 outside. That's a difference of 98 degrees, Sarah said. Nearly 100 degrees of temperature difference, held stable with minimal fuel. Another silence. Longer this time. Ashford cleared his throat. "And the ventilation concerns?" "The risk of carbon smoke." "The chimney draws perfectly," Sarah said. "The earth backing creates consistent draft. Cold air enters through the small gaps around the door, controlled gaps, not accidental ones. Warm air rises naturally through the flue. I've had no smoke problems, no headaches, no dizziness." Reinhardt walked the perimeter again, this time not as an inspector, but as a student. "The stone hearth against the earth wall? That's the key, isn't it?" "Part of it," Sarah agreed. "The earth acts like a heat sink. The stone absorbs and radiates. Together, they buffer the temperature. But the real key is the mass overhead and the mass around. Thermal inertia. Resistance to change. She gestured to the ceiling. That sod roof weighs about 2,000 pounds. It doesn't heat up during the day because there's no summer sun hitting it now. And it doesn't cool down fast at night because mass resists temperature change. Same with the walls. 3 feet of earth on 3 sides. The cold has to soak through all of that before it reaches me. It can't. Margaret Carver stepped forward. Mrs. Oland, Sarah, I owe you an apology. Sarah met her eyes. Waited. I called you uncivilized. I said you were teaching your children to live like animals. I was wrong. You weren't ignoring standards. You were applying principles we'd forgotten. Sarah nodded. Apology accepted. Reinhardt was still staring at the hearth. I've been building cabins for 15 years, he said, voice distant. I thought I knew what worked. But I was building the same thing over and over because that's what everyone built. I never asked why. He turned to Sarah. You asked why. I asked what I could do with less, Sarah said. Less money. Less timber. Less labor. The earth was free. The stone was free. The principles were free. I just had to apply them. Ashford pulled out a small notebook. Mrs. Oland, would you be willing to share your methods? Measurements, techniques, materials? The council would like to, that is, we'd like to help other families implement. Yes, Sarah interrupted. I'll share everything. And she did. Over the next week, Sarah's hillside cabin became a classroom. Families came in small groups. She walked them through the design, the depth of excavation, the angle of the south wall, the size of the firebox, the thickness of the sod roof, the placement of the chimney, the importance of drainage. She showed them her journal. Let them copy the numbers. 60 degrees inside. 1/3 the wood. 10 hours of heat retention from a single evening fire. Those numbers spread through Medicine Creek Valley like a fever. Not everyone believed it at first, but the families who'd visited, who'd stood in that stable warmth, who'd touched that radiating stone, they believed. And they started building. Spring 1882 came late to Montana Territory. The snow didn't fully melt until mid-April, and even then, the ground stayed cold. But the moment the frost broke, the sound of shovels filled Medicine Creek Valley. 4 families started construction in May. All of them hillside dugouts. All of them based on Sarah's design, with modifications. The Hendersons built into a south-facing slope a mile west of Sarah's claim. They added a second small window and extended their roof overhang to create a sheltered entryway. A lesson learned from watching snow pile against Sarah's door. Marcus Fletcher and his wife designed a hybrid, half earth-backed, half above ground, with the hearth positioned in the corner where 2 earth walls met. They called it a berm cabin, cheaper than a full dugout, but with most of the thermal benefits. The Kowalskis went full traditional. Deep excavation, thick sod roof, massive stone hearth. They hired Sarah as a consultant, paid her in labor, helping to expand her own root cellar and repair her fence line. By fall 1882, those 4 cabins were finished and occupied. By winter 1883, the settlement had its second test. Not as brutal as the winter of '82, but cold enough. Temperatures dropped in the -20s for a week in January. Long enough to measure. Long enough to compare. The new earth-sheltered cabins performed exactly as Sarah had predicted. The Hendersons burned half the wood of their neighbors in standard cabins. The Fletchers maintained a steady 55 degrees inside, with 1 fire per day. The Kowalskis, whose massive hearth was even larger than Sarah's, reported interior temperatures that barely fluctuated more than 5 degrees over a 72-hour period. Word spread beyond Medicine Creek Valley. By 1884, families in the adjacent townships were asking about the Olund method. By 1885, 23 cabins across 3 counties had incorporated some version of earth-backing, thermal mass hearths, or sod roofing. The technique evolved, adapted. People called it different things: hillside cabins, berm houses, Medicine Creek style. Some families only backed the north wall. Some built partial dugouts with full timber fronts. Some used the design for root cellars that doubled as emergency shelters. But they all traced the idea back to one source. A Swedish widow who'd been called crazy, dangerous, uncivilized. Gustav Reinhardt became one of Sarah's biggest advocates. In the spring of 1883, He rode out to her cabin with a proposal. He wanted to partner with her officially. She'd consult on designs. He'd handle the construction. Families who wanted earth-sheltered cabins could hire them both. Sarah agreed, with one condition. Women who wanted to build alone, or who couldn't afford labor, would get her advice for free. Reinhardt shook her hand. That's more than fair. Over the next 5 years, they worked together on 17 projects. Reinhardt learned to think beyond the standard frame, learned to ask why instead of how it's always been done. He became known not just as a builder, but as an innovator. But he never forgot the lesson. In 1887, at a territorial builders' gathering in Helena, Reinhardt gave a talk about thermal mass and earth-sheltered construction. He opened with a story. 5 years ago, he told the crowd, I told a woman that her design would kill her. I was wrong. I wasn't protecting safety. I was protecting tradition. She was protecting her children. And in doing so, she taught me that principles matter more than precedent. He paused, looked out at the faces watching him. She didn't have formal training. She didn't have money. She didn't have status. What she had was observation, humility, and a willingness to learn from people we'd dismissed as primitive. The Mandan, the trappers, the old ways. She took those lessons and applied physics. The result saved lives. Someone in the crowd called out, What happened to her? Reinhardt smiled. She's still there. Still in that hillside cabin. She's added on to it twice, dug deeper into the hill, expanded the hearth, built a greenhouse against the south wall that extended her growing season by 2 months. Her children are healthy. Her firewood costs are a fraction of her neighbors. And last I checked, 17 families in the valley consider her the smartest builder in Montana. The room erupted in applause. But the real legacy wasn't fame. It was function. By 1890, the deforestation problem that had plagued Medicine Creek Valley had stabilized. Families weren't stripping the ridges for firewood anymore. The earth-sheltered cabins reduced demand. Trees had time to grow back. The watershed stayed healthier. Economically, families saved money that went into livestock, equipment, seed. The settlement grew, thrived. Socially, something shifted too. Sarah had proven that being different wasn't the same as being wrong. That innovation could come from necessity, not just expertise. That women, widows, immigrants, people outside the power structure could solve problems the establishment had accepted as unsolvable. In 1891, when the settlement officially incorporated as the town of Medicine Creek, Sarah Oland was elected to the town council, the first woman to hold that position. She served 2 terms, and every winter, when the temperature dropped and the wind howled across the prairie, families slept warm in their hillside cabins, their earth-backed walls, their thermal mass hearths. They slept warm because one woman had refused to accept that the old way was the only way. She wasn't being reckless. She wasn't being foolish. She was being scientific. So here's the question I want you to think about. Which part of Sarah Oland's solution would you apply to your home today? The thermal mass hearth? The earth backing? The sod roof? The principle of using mass to buffer temperature instead of fighting it with constant fuel? Because here's the truth. We've built a world that fights nature instead of working with it. We heat boxes with thin walls and then wonder why our energy bills are insane. We've forgotten what the pioneers knew by necessity, that the earth is the best insulator we have. That stone remembers heat. That mass equals stability. Sarah didn't invent these ideas. The Mandan knew them. The Norse knew them. The Pueblo people knew them. She just listened when everyone else had stopped. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me about the coldest winter you've ever faced. And tell me, honestly, if you think you could survive 3 weeks at -38 with only a third of a cord wood. If you got value from this story, if you learned something that could actually save you money, or keep you warmer, or make you think differently about building, then hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you one real technique from history. Methods that worked when failure meant death. No fluff, no theory, just tested, proven, frontier intelligence. And if you want to go deeper, if you want the technical details, the measurements, the full breakdown of how these systems actually work, check out the video I've linked in the description. It's called The Physics of Frontier Heating. how thermal mass actually works. Sarah Olund died in 1924 at the age of 75. She lived in that hillside cabin for 42 years. When they found her journal after her death, the last entry was a temperature reading. January 14th, 1924. Outside, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Would used, half a day's worth. Still efficient. Still warm. Still proving the doubters wrong. That's the legacy, not fame. Function. I'll see you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.